So what are relative pronouns in Latin and what are their antecedents? A relative pronoun is a pronoun, first of all, so a word that stands in for a noun. And the relative pronouns in English will be translated who or which. Who or which. So, for example, the dog whom I love is getting old. That would be a relative pronoun in English, whom. Or the dog who loves me is getting old. Who is a relative pronoun. In Latin, the relative pronouns have different forms depending on their gender, whether they're nominative, feminine, or neuter, depending on their number, whether they're singular or plural, and depending on their case, whether they're nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, or ablative. And so you have a whole chart of pronouns arranged by these three categories, one word for each combination. Right now, we're not talking about that whole chart, which needs to just be memorized on its own, but right now we're talking about what do relative pronouns look like in a sentence, and how do they relate to their antecedents. An antecedent is the word that a pronoun refers to, the noun that it's referring to. So if in this sentence, the dog whom I love is getting old, whom is the relative pronoun. Who is whom talking about? The dog. So the dog would be the antecedent. Right now we're going to practice some sentences which cover how relative pronouns agree with their antecedents in gender and number, but not in case, because they get their case from their role in the relative clause. And we'll talk about what a relative clause is for a second. Let's look at our first example here. This sentence, de monstro quod in sylvis vivit multa audivi. Quad is our relative pronoun. I've underlined it. It means who or which. In this case, the antecedent is monstro, de monstro. This means about the monster who lives in the woods. Quad is singular because monstro is singular, one monster. And it's also neuter because monstro comes from monstrum, monstri, which is a neuter noun. However, the case of monstro here is ablative with de, about the monster. But the case of quad here is nominative. So it's agreeing with monstro in gender and number, but they're not agreeing in case. They have two different cases. And the reason quad is nominative is because in this black part, which is called the relative clause, quad is the subject. Who lives? He's doing the living. He's the subject in the woods. The monster which lives in the woods. I should say it, to be clear that it's neuter. And then this says, I heard many things. So I heard many things about the monster who lives in the woods. Let's look at some more examples. This sentence, the purple part of the sentence, says the monster is purple, Monster is neuter and it's nominative. So purple, the adjective, is neuter and nominative, agreeing with it. But this relative clause has the pronoun quies, which is genitive, and it's singular, and it's neuter. So monstrum is singular and neuter, but not genitive. And the reason is that quies has a genitive role in this relative clause. And this says, the monster whose friend is shouting is purple. Who's purple? The monster, not the friend. And we know that because monster and purpurium are agreeing, but amicus, the friend, is in the relative clause. And we can actually keep this one main sentence and substitute a whole bunch of different relative clauses within it, which is what I've done here. So we could say, the monster to whom, dative, I gave the dog is purple. Qui is, again, neuter and singular because of monstrum, but it's dative, so it's a different case. Or we could say the monster whom I love is purple. And quad here is accusative because it's the direct object of amo, whom I love or which I love. And then here we have an ablative relative pronoun. The monster about which I have spoken is purple. So our big takeaway, we have relative pronouns. They all have an antecedent, which is a noun they refer to. The relative pronoun will agree with its antecedent in gender and number, but not case. And now we have one more thing to talk about, which is what is the difference between a main clause and a relative clause? Well, a relative clause is introduced by a relative pronoun, so that's easy to remember. See, usually the relative pronoun will be the first word in the clause. The way you can tell in a sentence a relative clause apart from a main clause is that the main clause stands on its own as its sentence. The relative clause is like more description off of the main clause, but it's not required to make a full sentence. So a relative clause will A, begin with a relative pronoun, and B, it will be subordinate to the main clause. It won't be as important grammatically as the main clause. Here I've made it really easy to recognize because I use two different colors. I use purple for our main clauses and black for the relative clauses. But if you think about it, I heard many things about the monster. That's a full sentence. But which lives in the woods by itself is not a full sentence. It's a relative clause. Or the monster is purple. That's a full sentence. So that's your main clause. Whose friend shouts is not, I mean, if it was a question, whose friend is shouting, then it would. But here it's not a question because it's whose friend shouts, a description. It's not a full sentence. So you can recognize a relative clause by the fact that it begins with a relative pronoun and that it's not a full sentence by itself.